So I want to thank David and Nancy for initiating this and for their kind words. If that was the best church supper I've ever had, that was certainly the best introduction I've ever had. I hope all of you have a handout, and that will make it a little easier to kind of follow my outline. But before I get into following the outline, I think you'll notice when I kind of try to pay attention to what I'm supposed to say versus when I'm talking like I am now. And that outline is what I'm supposed to be up to. But first, I have to congratulate this congregation for your recent decision to become a sanctuary church. A long time ago, I played a small role in the original sanctuary movement. And the movement today is a movement which is attracting more and more churches, many of them UCC. It's a courageous move on your part. Who knows what it will lead to, but I can guarantee you it will lead to deeper faithfulness and witness. And I'm just so proud of you and proud to be affiliated with you in coming before you today. David or Nancy shared my title. I'm retired as conference minister, but I'm still the sort of climate guy for our national denomination and go around the country speaking about climate change, mostly in churches, but also in universities and so forth. I have a website, jimantal.com, and there's a lot of good stuff on there. And before I launch into my prepared comments, I just want you to know that I come from a family of scientists. And my brother was the world's leading expert in charcoal before he died. He was a math physics guy. And my dad was the head chemical engineer for Mobil Oil. So when I was 8 years old, 1958, I distinctly remember talking with my father and my brother, but mostly with my father, about the world's second largest oil deposit, which was up in Canada. And that oil shale would never be tapped because it would be economically impossible to tap it. Of course, my dad was a chemical engineer, not a mechanical engineer. And to frack and to tap oil shale, you need to have horizontal drilling. And horizontal drilling was not invented and developed until the mid to late 1980s. My dad never imagined that was possible. So I could go on and on. There is one thing I want to add to what Nancy said, though, before I get into my prepared comments, and that is that resolution that you mentioned that 2 years ago passed the National Synod. When John Dorhauer is a very close friend of mine, so I call him Dorhauer, so forgive me for referring to our general minister and president as his last name. But when Dorhauer called me from Los Angeles, he was speaking, as he did today, to the New York Conference annual meeting. He was speaking to the California Conference annual meeting, and it was the day after Trump's announcement of the pullout from Paris. And he said, "Jim, will you write the resolution?" I said, "Yes." And then he said, "Can you write it in 90 minutes? Now, believe me, resolutions are hard to write. And writing one for 90 minutes is really, really hard. I say, "We'll see." And at 85 minutes, I was able to hit that send button. So they needed a 24-hour window in which to discern whether or not to vote. So that's why he had this deadline that he needed it by. Final thing I want to say is that we're going to have time for Q&A afterwards. That's the thing I really enjoy most. But I've distilled a lot of what I have to say into prepared comments. That will get us going. But part of the reason I gave you a handout was you can scribble questions down on that. So let me begin by talking about the situation in which we find ourselves, a situation to which God has called us, a world in which climate change is no longer some future event. Climate change is happening now. Drought is now measured in decades, not in years. Rainfall from big storms is now measured in feet, not in inches. The 5 feet of rain Hurricane Harvey dumped on Houston in 2017 was so heavy that it bent the tectonic plate by 2 centimeters. Throughout the United States, record high temperatures are outrunning record low temperatures by a ratio of 20 to 1. These persistent high temperatures are wreaking havoc with our forests. Fire season is now more than 78 days longer than it used to be, and in California, fire season is 24/7, 365. The temperatures would be a lot hotter were it not for the oceans. Oceans absorb over 93% of the heat created by global warming. And we've just learned that the oceans are warming 40% faster than we thought they were 10 years ago. As they absorb CO2, the oceans are becoming more acidic at a frightening rate in excess of any change the world has seen in 300 million years. As the oceans heat up, the water expands, ice caps melt, and sea level rises. In Louisiana, the worst-case scenario for human-caused sea level rise in their 2012 plan is now their best-case scenario, and that's happening everywhere. And on a larger scale, the Earth's temperature is already well into the range that existed during the Eemian period 120,000 years ago, when sea level was between 20 and 30 feet higher than it is today. And while the Trump administration is infamous for denying climate change, get this, last September, the Trump administration released a report justifying Trump's decision to freeze car and truck fuel efficiency standards. That's not the surprising part. What's shocking is that buried in that 500-page report is the recognition that human activity is causing climate change, and that by 2100, worldwide temperatures will increase by 7 degrees Fahrenheit or 3.5 degrees Celsius. That's from Trump's committee. I'm glad to discuss that during our Q&A. We also need to recognize that not since World War II have more human beings been at risk from disease or starvation than at this very moment. Climate change is the primary cause of droughts, which are increasingly rendering Africa uninhabitable. And if the droughts weren't bad enough, then the typhoons are. Finally, there are about 10 million plant and animal species in the world today, and 1 million of them are at risk of imminent extinction. Truly, we are in the midst of an unprecedented emergency. So now I want to name 5 broad ethical concerns that will help you understand why people of faith must engage climate change. But before I do that, let me just say that thank God that more and more people finally are acknowledging that climate change is real, it's human-caused, and it's an immediate threat. Almost 3 out of 4 Americans now accept that global warming is happening, and 2 out of 3 think it's affecting the United States. That's a new statistic. Those numbers are shifting. But when it comes to addressing climate change, many fail to understand the first broad ethical issue, that climate change is an injustice multiplier and accelerator. Let me spell that out for you. Climate change multiplies and accelerates injustice in 3 ways. The first injustice is that climate change is hitting the poorest and people of color first and worst. It's the poorest people who live in the areas most likely to flood, most prone to disease, most subject to droughts, heat waves, and various diseases that are now migrating due to climate change. And here in America, in our inner cities, there's a health crisis that gets worse each summer. As the temperatures rise, more and more cases of asthma are disabling and killing children and elderly people in our cities. The second injustice is that those most affected by climate change did not cause it and are powerless to stop it. For example, the farmers in parts of Africa who are losing their lands, either to drought or to unprecedented flooding, have a carbon footprint that is 1/200th the average carbon footprint of the average American. And the third injustice is that the people and institutions who actually caused and are causing climate change are not paying reparations for the catastrophic damage it's already causing. Not only that, but here in the United States, we actually subsidize fossil fuel companies to the tune of $25 billion a year. So whatever injustice issue concerns you most, climate change is making it worse. It is making it worse. That's why we can't regard climate change as just one among the many justice issues which we care about. It's both an injustice multiplier and an injustice accelerator. The second broad ethical concern associated with climate change is humanity's inadequate focus on and acceptance of intergenerational responsibility. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. And the third broad ethical concern associated with climate change focuses on our relationship and our attitude toward nature. With the exception of indigenous cultures, humanity regards nature as a treasure trove for exploitation. And yet some signs of hope are emerging. For example, New Zealand recently passed a law granting rights to a river system. Nevertheless, our current understanding of capitalism is insufficiently comprehensive. We write off the destruction of nature as an economic externality. As Ta-Nehisi Coates points out in his book, Between the World and Me, over the past few years, we have enslaved the earth. Over the past 200 years, we have built the modern world by exploiting resources. Nature took 150 million years to create. This is no different than our exploitation of black bodies over the past many centuries. To me, it's unthinkable that the major religions have developed over the past several thousand years in a way that seems to be okay with the notion of owning nature. If you're interested, I'm more than glad to talk further on that point during our Q&A. A fourth broad ethical concern raised by climate change is the need for a new understanding of fiduciary accountability. Let's not forget that as people of faith, it's our forebears in the faith who introduced the notion of fiduciary and fiduciary responsibility. It means to keep faith with. The current understanding of fiduciary allows directors of companies to claim the moral and legal high ground if all they do is maximize short-term monetary profit for their shareholders. For centuries, the church has ceded to the legal and investment world the exclusive right to interpret society's understanding of fiduciary responsibility. I believe it's both crazy and criminal to think that an investment advisor has satisfied his or her fiduciary obligation by assuring maximum financial profit over the next quarter while ignoring the fact that the investment will end up wrecking the home of the investor. I'm not alone in this view. As I discuss in my book, former Securities and Exchange Commissioner Beavis Longstreet, who gets the prize for the best name, right? Beavis Longstreet. He's in agreement with me, and if you're interested, we can talk more about that during Q&A. By the way, he served 3 terms on the Securities and Exchange Commission, and he was originally appointed by Reagan. He and I have become buddies. He's a great guy. A fifth broad ethical issue is the short-term time horizon that dominates both investment practices as well as political agendas. Humanity needs to follow moral principles that take seriously the fact that for the past many decades, we have acted in ways that have consequences for centuries or maybe eons. So in addition to these broad ethical concerns, let me lift up 5 key theological guides for faith communities in a time such as this. The first is that with God, there are no externalities. Now, I can make a long story out of this, but I want to sort of compress the long story and tell you. So what does this mean? Those of you that are economists already know what I'm talking about. But if you're not an economist, just think for a moment. When I was a kid, I often thought that confession was silly. The reason confession is silly is God already knows, right? So who are you talking to? You know, you like telling God something God already doesn't know already? Come on, right? And so with God, you can't fake God out, or else it's not God. If God is omniscient, then you can't have, I'm going to switch now to economics, you can't have externalities that, we're not going to consider the fact that we might be producing CO2 and creating a greenhouse effect on the earth. You know, we have the legal right to extract oil from this ground and we're going to do it. No, with God, there are no externalities. We have to see the whole picture. Okay, that's point 1. Point 2. God calls communities, not just individuals. So I haven't done this, but maybe one of you will do it. Read the Bible. All right, that's a big assignment. But with 2 highlighters. With yellow, highlight every time God calls an individual or gives the impression of a personal relationship with God that has to do with your vocation and what I want you to do and what I want you to do. Highlight that in yellow. And then in pink, highlight every time God calls a community, like the community of Israel, for example. And highlight that in pink. And the ratio of pink to yellow will be about 20-1. And yet, at least in America, and I think this is true worldwide, most people and most ministers portray Scripture as if it is a response to the question of personal salvation. Sure, that's in there. I'm not pushing that off. But there's a whole lot more in there about communal salvation. And I, for one, would like to see many more sermons on communal salvation than on personal salvation. Third point, Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Back in 1971 and 72, when the U.S. passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, the basis for those legal actions was the public trust doctrine, saying that it was the responsibility of any government to, the government was empowered through the public trust to be responsible for and enact laws protecting the atmosphere, clean air, and the water, Clean Water Act, right? And that's the reason why the smog in LA, where I grew up, has gotten so much better. It was because of that Clean Air Act. And you can look at the Hudson River, for example, and the Clean Water Act had huge impact on that. And we could go on and on with examples like that. Right now, and I'll mention this in my sermon tomorrow, there's a group of teenagers who for the past 4 years, and it's still ongoing, have been bringing a federal lawsuit, a constitutional lawsuit against the U.S. government, saying that it is the responsibility of the government to assure that they not inherit a world wrecked by climate change. And it's the public trust doctrine. This is what government is supposed to do. The government is supposed to be so arranged that it holds these resources that we have gotten, we think, from God, but you could simply say, in common, as common dwellers on this earth, and governments are supposed to protect that. I'll say more about our children's trust in tomorrow's sermon, but as people of faith, and this would be true of every faith perspective, the earth is the Lord's. Fourth point, our covenant with God is for all time and with all creatures. Go back and read Genesis chapter 9, and you realize God's covenant isn't just with people. It turns out God's covenant is with people and creatures. It's in the same phrase. And not just that, it's also and for all time. That's just one phrase. And, we sort of go at it and pretend, oh, no, it's just God and me up on the top of the mountain, and creatures, they ought to get their own thing together. No. that's not how it works. We're all in this together. Our faith tells us that. Every faith tells us that. And then finally, the fifth point here is the most basic moral instruction held by every world religion. It's in both Hebrew Scripture and in the New Testament. It's in every doctrine you can find, and that is that we're called to love our neighbors as ourselves, the golden rule. But on this new earth, we need to recognize that future generations are no less our neighbors than the person sitting right next to you in the pew. And just think for a moment, all the world religions were founded more than 1,000 years ago, and humanity did not have the power to impact generations of future living beings. And so it's no wonder that these deep religious leaders who, were just incredible human beings, it never occurred to them that we needed an ethical principle to protect the future because we didn't have the power. But now we do. And so we need to reformulate the golden rule to embrace future generations every bit as much as we embrace people who are alive today. All right, so that's kind of a foundation for what I want to do next, which is to take kind of a deeper dive and focus for a few minutes on vocation. In a time such as this, some of you may hear like a biblical reference when I say that. That's from the 4th chapter of the book of Esther. In a time such as this, what's your personal calling? What's your congregation's calling? And the big question I want to raise is, what is the calling of our generation, given the context that I've just outlined? Everywhere I speak, I find people longing to hear candid, unalloyed truth, especially in response to their two most frequent questions. What can I do? What can one person do about climate change? And what can our congregation do that would make any difference? So as it turns out, we've been born at a time when the continuity of creation is coming undone. We are living on what I call the hinge of history. We're the first generation to foresee and the final generation with an opportunity to forestall the most devastating consequences of climate change. So this has huge implications for us as people of faith. But I'm delighted to tell you that our denomination, the United Church of Christ, we actually get this. In a recent national survey of about 1,000 UCC members, a shocking response came back. So I actually talked to the pollsters, and pollsters are they're like professional pollsters. They do like 10 polls a day, and they have that kind of background. They had never seen a result where 100% of the people came together in a response, and that was the case for the United Church of Christ. 100% of nearly 1,000 UCC members from across the country believe we have a moral responsibility to create a safe and healthy climate for ourselves and for our children. So as we begin to reconsider vocation in a time of climate crisis, let's attend to God's call to initiate a new story. And let's think about what are the qualities we need to nurture and develop. So let me begin by sharing a brief excerpt from one of my favorite authors on adaptive change, Margaret Wheatley. She wrote this 20 years ago. Recently, I've been reflecting on how strange we are, my generation, to believe that we can help birth a new world without affecting our personal career progress. I'm aware of how little courage our lives have demanded of us. Courage is the first quality. Courage is no longer optional. Courage is required. Let me illustrate the courage that is required by reading a brief passage from my book, and listen to how it provides an illustration of the influence that religious leaders can have if they have the courage to bear witness from their lives. So I'm going to read a passage from Abraham Joshua Heschel, a Jewish rabbi who evacuated from Germany in April 1938. 1 month before he left, he addressed Quakers in Germany, and this is what he said. "We have profaned the word of God, and we have given the wealth of our land, the ingenuity of our minds, and the dear lives of our youth to tragedy and perdition. There has never been more reason for man to be ashamed than now. We have bartered holiness for convenience, loyalty for success, love for power, wisdom for information, tradition for fashion. Let the blasphemy of our time not become an eternal scandal." And then I want to share with you a portion of a letter written 1 year after World War II ended by Konrad Adenauer. He would, a couple of months after he wrote this letter, he would become the first post-war chancellor of West Germany. And he served, as many of you may know, in a concentration camp for most of World War II. So Konrad Adenauer is writing to a pastor in Bonn, Germany. "I believe that if all the bishops had together made public statements from pulpits on a particular day, they could have prevented a great deal. That did not happen, and there is no excuse for it. It would have been no bad thing if the bishops had all been put in prison or in concentration camps as a result. Quite the contrary. But none of that happened, and therefore we must keep quiet about it." So courage is the first point, and I think we sell ourselves way short. We who are people of faith sell ourselves way short for failing to realize how much power a religious witness can make. And that's why I, as a denominational leader, really spent so much of my time trying to organize other denominational leaders to make that witness. So if courage is the first quality, urgency is the second quality. And no one communicates the urgency of the climate crisis better than Greta Thunberg. She's been focused on climate change since she was 8 years old. Last August, she embraced a new vocation. She initiated a school strike for climate. First, it was only her out in front of Sweden's parliament every Friday. Then after a few months, tens of thousands of students throughout Europe were joining her. In November, she explained her urgency in her TED Talk. She was 15 at the time, and she was asked to give a TED Talk. You can see it on YouTube. She said, "If climate change were real," I'm quoting now, "we wouldn't be talking about anything else. As soon as you turn on your TV, everything would be about that. Headlines, radio, newspapers. You would never read about anything else. It's as if there was a world war going on." After that TED Talk, she was then asked to address the annual UN gathering, the CCOP gathering that was in Poland, and she went and addressed them. And then she went to Davos, where the richest people in the world gather with the CEOs of the biggest companies in the world, and all the oil companies are there, and she was asked to address them. I'll quote her in my sermon, what she said there. The challenge of climate change is no less urgent than when the world faced the threat of fascism. And so it may be helpful to be reminded of something from that era. And I'll repeat what I'm about to say in my sermon because I think it's worth hearing twice for those of you that will be there tomorrow. In 1939, if FDR had gone to Edsel Ford and said, Edsel, I want you to build the largest manufacturing plant in the world, okay? And I want you to do it like in the next 6 months, all right? And then I want you to make, in that plant, I want you to make something you've never made before. No, not a car, Edsel, not a car. Something with actually over 1 million parts. And I want you to turn out one of these things every 24 hours. Do you think you could do that for me, Edsel? If FDR had said that to Edsel Ford in 1939, Edsel Ford would have said, Mr. President, you are out of your mind. But when FDR said it to him in 1941, 6 months later, the Willow Run manufacturing complex was completed, and every 24 hours, it was turning out a B-24 Liberator bomber. If the alarm of World War II can prompt the largest industry of America to willingly and urgently redirect its resources and change its business plan, then it is up to our generation to muster the courage that climate change requires of us to create a new story. A story so powerful that we hasten the day when each human heart will be governed not by grief, but by hope, not by constraint, but by generosity, not by selfishness, but by sharing. So if courage and urgency are the first two qualities we must embrace, the third quality is scale. The scale of today's challenge is enormous, and so are the solutions that are available right now. The Green New Deal that Congress is now considering and our nation is now discussing seeks to implement these solutions on an unprecedented scale. As we transform our energy infrastructure, we will create abundant, clean energy jobs along with a more just economy. And here's the reason this is even possible. God's great gift of creation, what I call the original Green New Deal, offers clean, renewable energy on an almost unimaginable scale. Solar energy is so abundant that if we covered only 0.3% of the Earth's land area with solar panels, that's an area the size of perhaps Spain or a little over 1% of the Sahara Desert, we could power all of humanity's electrical needs. By the year 2030, America could generate 80 to 85% of its power from sun, wind, and water, and 100% by 2050, and so could 139 other countries. I'm delighted to tell you that next month, our National UCC Synod will consider a resolution I wrote endorsing the Green New Deal. Given our denomination's motto, we're not radical, we're just early. I hope and I expect that it will pass. So keeping in mind the qualities of courage, urgency, and scale, let me suggest several themes of the new story God is calling us to create and embrace as we embrace a new vocation. The first theme is to make our houses of worship safe enough and relevant enough to do three things. First, we need to talk about climate change as part of our church activity. Katharine Hayhoe, who is currently the foremost climate scientist in America and an evangelical Christian, Katharine Hayhoe says the most important thing we can do is to talk about climate change, because once we talk about it, we can embrace the urgency and muster the courage we need to do something about it. Second, we can hear each other's testimony. What if, for example, I'm not trying to mess with your liturgy, Pastor, but what if, for example, once a month, or maybe even once a week, you were to have a 1-minute testimony Now, and if you actually do this, you got to keep it to 1 minute, all right? Wherein a member of the church comes up and over the course of a minute simply shares with the others a change he or she has made in their life that has to do with the sort of things we're talking about tonight. That's a way of talking about it and of bearing witness to one another. And third, in church, we can process our grief. And by doing so, we will empower one another to take action as we re-engage the long emergency. In a time such as this, we must acknowledge that the continuity of creation upon which thousands of generations of humans have sought moral progress, that continuity is over. And one thing more, we must recognize that the existential dread we experience can serve as a precondition of hope. Once we have a safe enough context in which we can share our grief and share our dread with one another, then by the grace of God, the Holy Spirit comes upon us, and we can then, in fact, manifest hope by mustering the courage and taking on action. So the next two themes emerge from that UCC resolution that Nancy was referring to in her introduction. The resolution, for the first time, I think, in UCC history, the National Gathering, the General Synod of the UCC, told pastors they needed to preach on something specific, climate change. And okay, don't tell your pastor what he needs to preach on, okay? That's not a takeaway from this talk. Because we respect the freedom of the pulpit. And so for 400 years, we have not told our pastors what to preach on. That's the whole point of being called to a pulpit, right? But it turns out preaching on climate change is not easy. Pastors are, many of them, ambivalent about it. We need to preach on climate change. That's point number one. Point number two, we need to resist all new fossil fuel infrastructure. So I could give you several examples throughout the country where UCC folks, some of them pastors, are leading efforts to block the building of new fossil fuel infrastructure because it's not needed. The only reason we're building new pipelines, the only reason that we're building new LNG compressors, it's to send our fracked oil and fracked gas out of the country. Okay, thank you for that shout out. But on the other hand, I forget what state it was, but this has happened, I think, now in more than half a dozen states. States are beginning to pass laws making the blocking of fossil fuel infrastructure a felony offense. So I've been arrested. I've lost count more than 12 times. I think it's like 15. And most of those arrests are blocking fossil fuel infrastructure. And I've served some time in jail, but not much. And these states are upping that game to felony offense. So I'm not encouraging any of you to go out and get arrested, but there are plenty of ways. I could talk for 2 hours about how we've done it in Massachusetts. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm in New York, right? New York just had a success. There was a planned, what was it called? The Williams pipeline, right? And it was to take liquefied natural gas that was condensed from fracking in Pennsylvania through New York in order to offshore it to other countries. And that effort has been at least temporarily blocked and probably permanently blocked. And that's because people like you decided they're going to make it part of their daily work to write letters to the editor, to go out and protest, to use the kind of influence you have with perhaps the governor, with perhaps your legislator, and so forth. So let me say a little bit about this next topic, which is a phrase that I've used for a long time. We need to make civil disobedience a normative, spiritual expression or spiritual practice. It needs to become as normative as prayer, at least in my opinion, because I think that's the only way we're going to change. For thousands of years, faith communities have encouraged their members to express their conscience on important public issues. For thousands of years, nonviolent civil disobedience has been one faithful expression of religious values when those values are in conflict with the laws of the land. Many Christians are not aware that after Jesus' death, Peter and Paul spent more time in jail than out. And the reason was because, to be faithful Christians, they were doing things that the emperor found to be illegal. It's time for faith communities to affirm their role in supporting those called by their conscience to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. I understand that for many people of faith, including some of those already engaged in the climate change movement, civil disobedience is off the table. And that was true as well for previous social change movements, such as the abolition movement. First and foremost, civil disobedience is an act of personal conscience. God calls some, but not all, to consider this witness. But as we enter this long emergency, it's time for faith communities to be more public in their recognition of civil disobedience as an appropriate expression of faithfulness to God. Or to put it another way, it's time for people of faith to tell the truth about how the industrial civilization is ending nature as humanity exercises our hubris. It's time for people of faith to testify to an understanding of God that is not undone by our undoing of God's creation. Among other things, such testimony will certainly create the conditions for civil disobedience to become a normative expression of faithfulness. So here's a fifth theme of the new story God is calling us to create. I'm encouraging congregations to become Acts 2:42 congregations by valuing the common good above personal economic benefit. A first step would be to undertake new behaviors in the following areas and to understand your change of behavior as a change you're making because it's a spiritual discipline. For example, how you shop, how you eat, what you eat, you're driving, you're sharing, you're spending, you're flying, you're using energy and recycling and more. Consider providing rides for one another, finding each other jobs, sharing each other's car or a lawnmower, helping each other conserve. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if that's something that interests you. A sixth theme is we need to reevaluate how our houses of worship use land. So back in World War II, 80% of Methodist churches had victory gardens on the front lawn of their churches. And no one hesitated to do that, right? So we have a church in Massachusetts that was thinking about this issue of their assets, basically. I'll get to financial assets in a minute. We got this building, and we have AA come in here and other groups like that. But we also have land, and it was like an aha for the church. And it turns out the grandchild of one of its members was an expert in permaculture. So the church took a chunk of its land, like a pretty big chunk actually, and created a permaculture garden out there. And they invited people from around the town who were like totally into permaculture gardening, would never come to church. And those people not only began tending the permaculture garden, but they began attending church also. So use of our land, reevaluate the use of our land that our houses of worship occupy is an important theme in this new story we're called to create. Here's a seventh theme. We need to reevaluate our investments. Many of you are aware that in 2013, the United Church of Christ became the first national body of any kind and the first religious body to vote to divest from fossil fuels. Now, I don't know if your church has an endowment, so I don't want to make this like personal about your congregation. but hundreds, I believe it's actually thousands of churches that do have endowments, have over the past 6 years asked their portfolio managers to purge their endowments of any fossil fuel stock. In fact, it's not just churches that are doing this. Philanthropies are doing this. Universities are doing this. Cities and towns and pension funds are doing this. And if you add all of that up in the past 6 years, since Bill McKibben first called for a divestment movement, and the UCC was the first body to ever vote to do it, in those 6 years, over $8 trillion of portfolios have purged themselves of fossil fuel stock. If you go to any investment advisor today, they'll all say, oh, sure, you want to do that? We have all kinds of options for you to have a balanced portfolio without any holdings in fossil fuel stocks. If you had gone to them 5 years ago, they would have said, what are you talking about? You can't have a balanced portfolio without being in the energy sector. That's how quickly the shift has taken place. It's completely phenomenal. And here's a final theme, and then we're going to get into Q&A. A final theme in this new story that God is calling us to create. We need to consider our congregation's collective capacity to leverage assets. So, what if half the members of this congregation, after discerning what you've heard tonight and tomorrow, what if half the members were to say, you know what, I'm willing to put in 5% of my free time on this issue? Do you have any idea the kind of impact you could have? If some of you who made that commitment were then to recruit other faith communities to do the same, and then Ithaca becomes a source of communicating to other cities to do the same, that's how revolutions begin. That's what Greta Thunberg has done. She's just one girl from Sweden, and on March 15th, here in America, worldwide, she had 1.4 million kids worldwide on every continent, 122 countries. 1.4 million kids skipped school. And that's because 6 months earlier, one girl in Sweden started doing it. So we can create a revolution. It's really up to us to do it. So let me conclude by saying that as people of faith, God is calling us to face reality, to confess complicity, to grieve over the losses and irreversible mistakes we and previous generations have made, and to imagine a different future. A future in which we give our lives to creating a new story in which diverse people unite in common cause. We generate a defiant and undefeatable hope. We persist in seeking reconciliation with all of creation. In responding to God's call, we are embracing God's dream. As brokenhearted as God must be over what we have done to the gift of creation, God still has a dream. However much we rebel, however much we ignore God's instructions, however much we abuse God's gift of creation, we cannot diminish the power of God's dream. It's a dream that's anchored in love, not exploitation, a dream in which every living thing is a reflection of God. In God's dream, everyone has enough, and all are beneficiaries of God's abundance. God dreams that humans will enjoy spiritual, not material progress. God's dream envisions a just world at peace because gratitude has dissolved anxiety. Generosity has eclipsed greed. God dreams of a time when love and mutual respect will bind humanity together, and the profound beauty of creation will be treasured. So let's embrace God's dream as our own. Thanks be to God.